For today, we're going to focus on understanding. And this week is kind of the meat of the class. This is the stuff that I get really excited about. I love talking about this. And what I want to talk about tonight mainly revolves around these 4 tendencies. And so I've kind of created a worksheet so you guys can follow along. But there's these tendencies that we have that make it difficult to understand where people are coming from when we go and interact with them. So kind of assuming that we've answered this question from week 1 of where are these people. So assuming we've found them, now what do we do? How do we interact with them? And so I want to unpack some of those additional barriers that can surface when we go to interact. So the first tendency that I want to talk about is that we tend to operate out of a system of grace a system of sympathy rather than grace. So let me unpack this. We all know what sympathy is, right? Feeling sorry for or with another person. And we've all experienced it, both giving sympathy and receiving it. But what we might not realize is that there's actually this elaborate system of principles and rules that kind of go into how we're supposed to feel or express our sympathy. And these rules of sympathy can look different in different cultures. But I'm going to kind of talk about what it looks like here in our culture. And this is based on research done by a sociologist named Candace Clark. Okay, so let's say we have a situation with a sympathizer, so the person that is going to be giving the sympathy. In a split second, the kind of first thing that goes through the sympathizer's mind is to determine whether this person is deserving of their sympathy. We often don't realize it, but we're in this moment considering whether this plight that the person is going through is deemed worthy of sympathy. So some kind of acceptable plights are maybe loss of a loved one, loss of your job, illness, fatigue, running into car trouble, things like that. And it can depend on the time and context even as to whether or not that's worthy of something we would give sympathy to. Sympathy can also be influenced by social factors. So we could see that a woman with car trouble might get more sympathy than a man with car trouble. Or children that are doing something might gain way more sympathy than an adult who would do the exact same thing. And as we consider what grounds are worthy of sympathy, we're also making an assessment of who is worthy of sympathy. So we can use the famous example of the boy who cried wolf. That's kind of our illustration here. This boy, he made so many false claims to sympathy that he literally ran out of sympathy claims. So the people around him no longer really cared or felt sympathetic for what he was going through. He was no longer worthy of receiving their sympathy. And for those of you who've been on the side of giving sympathy, you know that when you don't follow these rules, you can often feel like you're being taken advantage of or kind of conned, that you've given out too much sympathy to some undeserving recipient. Or maybe we don't give sympathy because we think the person is actually responsible for the situation, that maybe they've done something to cause it, or maybe they haven't done enough to try to fix it. And while it feels like, maybe you don't understand exactly what they're going through, you kind of run out of sympathy for them. So why is this important? Because there are limits to sympathy. Sympathy runs out. And when you're trying to serve or be around people in our community that have significant sin patterns and destructive habits and deep hurts, it's likely that you're going to run out of sympathy. The book, When Helping Hurts, talks about this and calls it compassion fatigue. That there's times when you fail to see results in the people that you're trying to help, that you can actually start feeling really negative towards them and not really want to help and be less willing to help them overall. And so I'm not saying that sympathy is a bad thing. Like, it's a very natural, normal human emotion, and it definitely serves its purpose in social interactions. But we really need to be aware that sympathy is conditional. And so So what's the countercultural response? How do we not conform to the ways of this world? I believe that the proper response here is to operate out of grace rather than of sympathy. The emotion may or may not be there as you're talking to someone, as you're interacting with them, but grace is not based on our actions. Grace is about Jesus, and Jesus' grace does not run out. So when we fail over and over again, we know as Christians that God gives us grace. So how can we apply the same thing to impacting our city? Again, we're talking about people that are often already deemed unworthy of our sympathy. That they've done something or failed to do something that's just already knocked them out of the running for sympathy. Or maybe we do feel sympathy for them in the beginning, but then they seem just really ungrateful. Or nothing seems to be changing and they just keep cycling through the same thing. And then your flesh kicks in and your sympathy runs out. So how do we operate out of grace then? I think to do this, the first thing we have to remember is who we are and who God is. That we're all sinners covered by the blood of Jesus and saved by His grace. And that it's His plan for the good news to be preached to the poor and the lost. Tim Keller wrote in his book, Generous Justice, that there's a direct relationship between a person's grasp and experience of God's grace and his or her heart for justice and the poor. So in these moments when our flesh fails and we just feel like we have nothing more to give, can we get out of the way and allow the Holy Spirit to pour out grace on us and on those that we are with? And to help us through these times of feeling frustrated and that we just can't see any results on what we're doing, or that we're being taken advantage of, or immorality and sin is running rampant in this world. Can we just get out of the way and let the Holy Spirit work? And I think about God's words that Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians, and my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. Sympathy can definitely be an area of weakness. But we can't do any of this without Jesus and without the Holy Spirit working through us. So these sympathy rules are very much a reflection of our culture. And if we operate by them, I really don't think that we'll be seen as living any differently than those who haven't experienced the grace and forgiveness of Jesus. So that was the first tendency. The second tendency is that in our interactions with the poor and the marginalized, we tend to focus on relief rather than development. When we think of poverty, and the first thing that often comes to mind is a lack of material things. Okay, so lack of food, lack of clean water, they don't have money, there's not enough housing, things like that. And these are true things, they're very true things. But there's also way more to poverty than just material deprivation. So there's this really great book called Voices of the Poor, and it actually helps us see much deeper into what poverty really is. What this book did, they did a bunch of research, and they looked and they allowed the poor to speak specifically about their poverty. And so this book explores kind of the multi-dimensional and interlocking aspects of poverty. So from material well-being to lack of employment to the psychological aspects of poverty, the absence of basic infrastructure in a country, the lack of assets that the poor might have, and the institutions and systems that can lock poor people into poverty. And it specifically explored how the poor defined poverty for themselves. And one of the most interesting findings is the way the poor people talked about their poverty in terms of shame, feeling inferior or powerless, not having a voice, and feeling socially isolated. And this book shows that the poor are very much aware of the shame and humiliation that can come through poverty. They're often aware that they don't have the economic or political power to do the things they need to do to fully participate in society, or to carry out the things they want to do with their lives. So for example, there can be a lot of shame for not being able to fully participate in cultural celebrations. So not being able to buy your kids gifts for Christmas, or even do like natural things like buy back to school books and supplies when school starts. When people experience this long-term poverty, so long-term feelings of shame and powerlessness and vulnerability, sometimes there can be this almost fatalistic acceptance that nothing can change. And we see that there can be a loss of meaning and purpose and hope in a person's life. In addition to this, there can also be an extreme lack of trust for anyone and anything. But if we think about these things, like these are social relational needs, and even sometimes spiritual needs. Needs that we often overlook because we're often so focused on material relief. So for those that went to the soup kitchen this week, we talked about noticing some of these things. The extreme amount of distrust, the loneliness and social isolation, that some people just came because they seem to want to just be around people. And talking about their life situations as if it's hopeless, or they're just waiting. They're just waiting for the disability check, or waiting for the next job, or waiting for their next big break, or whatever it is. So remember this chart from week 1, the 4 different relationships here? We can see poverty is rooted in the brokenness in all 4 of these foundational relationships. So we're all poor and lacking because of this brokenness. There's spiritual poverty caused by the brokenness between us and God. And there's poverty of being in ourselves, that there's this brokenness there. What? Oh, I think I know the thing. Sorry. And then poverty of community, so our brokenness with others. And poverty of stewardship, in the way that we're supposed to be stewards over the earth and over creation. And all these broken relationships here, they interact to affect the broader social, political, economic, and even religious systems and structures that are in effect in our society. And so remember again that we talked about Jesus as the reconciler of these relationships, coming to put us back into right relationship in all 4 of these ways. So for us to holistically engage our city, I think we need to go beyond just meeting these immediate relief type needs. But those can be kind of what's most obvious, right? We look around and that's what we see. And there's definitely times that relief is needed. There's this emergency or urgent need that we need to go and step in and help. But if we continually operate out of this mindset of relief, we're kind of treating people as if they're in this constant state of emergency. And rather than seeing maybe what else is going on in their situation. And then we can actually lock them into this place if we're just operating based on relief all the time. And that we're treating the symptom rather than maybe the underlying cause. And so the book, When Helping Hurts, is kind of based on this whole principle that even when we're trying to help, we can actually end up hurting people, the people that we're really trying to help. And that we can just get stuck over and over in executing the same kind of relief efforts. And so how do we move people past just this need for relief? I want to talk specifically about development. As opposed to relief, which should be more temporary and for emergencies only, development is based on a process of ongoing change, based on the idea of working with people, engaging with them, building relationships and developing community, and doing life with them. With the goal, just like Jesus has, of restoring them to right relationship with their families and with their communities, with themselves, and ultimately, and most importantly, their relationship with God. So development is about people and processes, not about projects and products. And so we'll talk more next week about how we actually can engage in development. But for tonight, the principle that I want us to walk away with is that while relief is important and necessary, we have to find ways to move beyond this emergency state of mind and get to development. So this leads me into the third tendency, that we tend to engage in paternalism rather than empowering others. Simply stated, paternalism is doing things for people that they can do for themselves, rather than empowering and walking alongside them as they work through problems and situations they're facing. We have a tendency to kind of assume that we have the best ideas or know exactly what needs to be done in a situation. That maybe it's all about pouring resources into this community, or getting better education, or maybe even relocating people out of their bad neighborhoods. We have a tendency to assume that we have more to share intellectually and even spiritually than the poor do. And we forget that the poor could actually have really good insight into their situations and that we need to listen to them. And we also tend to think that our middle class lifestyle is what's best and what we should be striving for. We need to be acutely aware of the problems in our own lifestyle and in this middle class way of life. This American dream upward mobility thing may not be what we're trying to work towards. So paternalism is a pretty simple concept, but it's really easy for anyone to fall into. And often the poor have already experienced and come to expect that this is what they're going to be treated like. But paternalism can actually exacerbate those feelings of shame and powerlessness that have no control over their lives. So I want to share a story from the book When Helping Hurts that I think really illustrates how we can unintentionally act out of paternalism instead of looking for opportunities to empower. So When Helping Hurts, the author tells this story at the beginning of a personal experience he had while teaching a business class in a slum community. So there had been this witch doctor that had been coming to his class. And she had been so impacted by what he had said that she was going to go forsake her witchcraft and turn her life over to Jesus. And so she brought all her bags of herbs and witch brews to the church, and they literally burned them right there on the floor. And she publicly confessed her sin. And a woman named Elizabeth, who is the director of the women's ministry there, she gave her a new name. She gave her the name of Grace. And now the book's version is way more detailed and dramatic, so you should read it if you want all the details. But for the next 5 weeks, Grace regularly came to this class. But then one week, she was absent, and they found out that she had become sick. And so the author, one of the authors of this book, and Elizabeth, decided to go find Grace in her slum community and check on her. And they found her laying on the floor, barely able to whisper. So she had developed tonsillitis, and as a person with HIV, she couldn't go to the hospital. They wouldn't treat her there. So she had literally paid a neighbor to cut out her tonsils with a kitchen knife. And so the author and Elizabeth, they were there and they prayed for Grace. And as they began to walk back to church and discuss what to do, Elizabeth said, okay, she needs penicillin. She's going to die if she doesn't get penicillin because of infection. And so the author, as he's recalling the story, he says he remembers he reached immediately into his pocket and pulled out the money that was needed for Elizabeth, and he gave it, or for Grace, and he gave it to Elizabeth. And so she took it right to Grace. And the end of this story is happy. Grace recovers the penicillin, literally saved her life, and she returns later and keeps coming to this class. But the author kind of leaves us with this question of, as he's flying home, it's like, maybe I did something that could actually hurt in this situation. I was trying so hard to help. And so he kind of starts pointing to subtle ways in which he may have actually caused harm in the situation, in spite of the fact that he really did save her life by buying this penicillin. And so he describes the decision to pay for penicillin as potentially harmful to the church, its pastor, the refugees that have been attending this business class, and even Grace herself. So keep in mind that the author defines the essence of poverty alleviation as reconciling relationships, what we've been talking about. And so Grace, while she was clearly in need of relief, she was absolutely unable to help herself. She was in an emergency situation. The question, though, here was, who really is the best person to provide relief to Grace in this situation? The author describes that his failure to consider the local assets that already existed in the slum, including the church and the pastor, the small amount needed to get this medicine, and the social bonds of all these refugees that were around there, that was actually something valuable. And then he admits there was probably enough time to kind of go back to that church and rally them together to, it was like 8 cents per person to actually help Grace. And they could have probably easily kind of rallied together and done that. But why does this matter? Why was this bothering him so much that this happened? The author puts it this way. He says, Grace desperately needed relationships in the community in general, and in the church in particular. Her former way of life had created many enemies. She was a witch doctor. People didn't like her, but she also had this power over them. And so, also being infected with HIV, she was going to need solid support structures in her life and as time went on. Neither the author nor Elizabeth, the women's ministry director, could provide this for Grace over the long haul. He was going home, and she didn't live in the slum. So Grace needed the members of her own community and the church to embrace her and to consider her as one of their own. And so he talks about that he really needed to go empower her community to come help her. By giving the money for penicillin, the author missed this opportunity to facilitate deep relationships between Grace and her community and the local support structures that she was going to need if she was going to survive long term. He wasn't always going to be there to reach into his pocket and help her. So as we work to engage in more development work, we need to also consider ways how we can empower people, not just do things for them. Things that empower are things that give life and that reinforce a person's value and that they're also created in the image of God. And if you do this, you'll not only be going against the grain of common attitudes to the poor, but you'll also be going against what the norm of what probably a lot of poor people expect that you would treat them in that way. So tendency number 4 is that we tend to focus on the individual rather than on the group. We all know that our American culture really pushes us to individualism. But focusing just on the individual can make us blind to the oppression and the injustice that is caused by or perpetuated by systems and the macro level structure. And so one tool that I think will help us kind of grasp this is this idea of a sociological perspective. And this is one of the things that I love about sociology. I think it helps us bring clarity and perspective to understand why it makes sense that people are the way they are. Why do they do the things that they do? And so we can hear things like the poor are lazy, or all these women that just have so many children with all these men, they just want to work the welfare system, or they're just promiscuous. But when we hear things, we need to realize that there's often way more going on in these situations than just laziness or promiscuity. And that, we don't necessarily need to overlook these personal sin issues necessarily, but we should seek to understand why it makes sense that they are the way they are. That we see this at such maybe a macro level that maybe it's not just about this one person. And so I want to dig into some of these specific examples that I just talked about. But first I want to share kind of how we can use this tool of the sociological imagination. So here's the first example. When in a city of 10,000 people, we have one man who is unemployed, we may be correct to assume that it's just this man's personal trouble of not having a job. We could maybe look at his character or his lack of skills is maybe the reason why he's unemployed. Or go out and look at some of the immediate opportunities he has in front of him and say like, what he could or should go pursue. Basically look at this individual to uncover the reason and the necessary action. But when in a nation of 50 million employable people, we have 12 million that are unemployed, this would suggest that there's this bigger issue happening. And that it's not likely that we'll find the solution by just looking at the range of opportunities for any one individual person. And what's happened here, what this suggests is that the very structure of opportunities has collapsed. And that we therefore must look beyond the individual to maybe the political or economic institutions of the society. Not merely this personal situation or the personal character of an individual affected. You know, we saw this happen in America fairly recently, that this class called the working class, they've struggled to find employment in the industries that they typically work with. And you've seen a lot of people very much slip into the lower class. But if we look at what's happened in our country, there were very real economic changes that took place. And we literally saw the shift in manufacturing and factory labor to overseas. And that it left this whole class in our country without viable work opportunities that they have relied on for generations. So to look at any one man or woman in this situation and point to character flaws or point to something that they did would be sorely misunderstanding the issue that's happening. Does that make sense? So let's look at some of the other examples that we raised before. So this question, why do so many poor women tend to have multiple children out of wedlock, maybe with a lot of different fathers, with no near-term intention of getting married? Again, an individual perspective says that maybe these women are promiscuous, or they don't understand birth control, or they're just trying to work the welfare system. You may have heard the term welfare queen before. But when you look at it from a larger group perspective, it's actually so common that there's probably something else that's going on here. So there's this great study that looked into this. And their book is called Promises I Can Keep, Why Poor Women Put Motherhood Before Marriage. The authors are Catherine Eden and Maria Kapalas. So they looked at a bunch of women, kind of the type of woman that we're talking about right here. And these women are typically from poverty-stricken, high-crime neighborhoods where it's pretty difficult to find a lot of job opportunities. These are women that were having their first child at the age of 21, but often they were happening a lot earlier, so like 15 or 17. And many also dropped out of high school, either before or right after their first child was born. But interestingly, when they were interviewed by these researchers, these women, the vast majority of them felt that they only got pregnant maybe 1 or 2 years earlier than what they would consider to be the ideal age. So whereas maybe educated middle-class women nowadays might think of the ideal age of having their first child closer to their 30s, this type of woman also has way more to gain financially if she puts off having children until later in life. She can sometimes even double her income by waiting. But these types of financial prospects aren't available for these poor or lower class women. Really, they don't have much to lose financially if they don't wait to have children or properly time the birth of their child. And this study cites research that shows poor women that had children really early compared to poor women that waited longer, that their overall earning potential over the course of their life was really about the same. So it's not like waiting to have children somehow gives them a brighter economic future. At the same time, while these women tended to agree that they wanted to have children really early, they also believed in postponing marriage. And it wasn't because they didn't value marriage. they actually took it so seriously that they'd rather wait to get married than to rush in and end up in divorce. And so if you think about it, when people are living in these neighborhoods full of crime and drugs, with a large percentage of the men involved in these activities are going to jail, the kind of prospects that are out there, there's not a whole lot of good men out there for these women. And the men that they do kind of connect with, they often don't really trust them to hold a job, to stay faithful, to stay out of trouble, things like that. And so for these women, it doesn't even seem attainable to get married before you have children. So then the question would be maybe, why have children at all? If you look, though, at kind of this dismal financial and educational life prospects that these women have, that they tended to view having children as the best that life has to offer. And that sometimes they saw it as the only way of obtaining purpose and validation and companionship in their lives. So social isolation was a major factor for these women as well. So what this is kind of saying is, in this kind of situation, there's low economic cost and high social value, making this kind of situation for these women very desirable. So do you see kind of how this sociological perspective can move us away from maybe placing the blame on the individual? And not that there aren't personal moral failures going on in these situations, because there definitely are. But there's also these larger structural, systemic factors at play that no one person is directly responsible for. Okay, so let's look at another, sorry, I forgot my slide. So let's look at another example. This is from a famous study called Unequal Childhoods by Annette Lareau. And if any of you have read the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, he talks about this study. And in this study, Lareau looks at a handful of different households in order to study how parents raise their children. So looking at parenting styles, we might expect if maybe she found that there were really strict parents or really laid-back parents. But she actually found two distinct parenting philosophies, and they were almost perfectly divided along class lines. The middle class, wealthier parents had a specific parenting style, which she refers to as concerted cultivation. And the lower class, poorer parents had a specific parenting style, which she refers to as the accomplishment of natural growth. So let's look first at the middle class parents to see what she found. These parents were heavily involved in their children's free time. In fact, the children really didn't have a lot of free time because it was so structured. It was so full of activities. Sometimes they literally had calendars taped up to their refrigerators because it was so packed full of sports and extracurriculars. And this is all very labor-intensive for the parents, driving them here and making sure they had all their equipment and just facilitating the engagement in all these activities. And she saw that the primary goal for these parents was to actively foster and assess the child's talents and skills and put them in activities that would help them facilitate these things. In contrast, we see with the lower class, we see much less of this highly scheduled, intensive activity. In fact, it was almost not there. So you see these children instead, they have lots of free time just to hang out and play and be kids. You see them play with their siblings and their cousins and their neighbors. And a lot more of this kind of impromptu activity like pickup basketball or coming up with make-believe games. So the goal for these parents was to make sure that their children were cared for, that they were safe, that they had food, and that they were loved. But then give them the freedom to grow. So this kind of accomplishment of their natural growth as children. The second kind of major difference she identified in these parenting styles was the use of language. she found that middle-class parents used way more reasoning language when speaking to their children. They encouraged their children to ask questions and to negotiate and have confidence in what they were saying and confidence in talking to adults and asking adults questions. And they used all their verbal interactions as teaching moments, maybe to teach a new vocabulary word or to teach them how to clearly articulate their position on something. And when they did issue directives, like go do this, there was usually a lot more explanation and why behind that. In contrast, we see the lower class primarily use directives, sometimes just one-word directives like shower or go. And there wasn't a lot of explanation given, and there wasn't a lot of room for negotiation. And we also see differences in the way that parents intervened in institutions, like the school system, for example. So middle-class parents kind of took the view that it was their duty to intervene on behalf of their children, and when their children's needs weren't being met. So they would go talk to the teachers when their child's grades were suffering, or they would want a lot of detail about what's going on in the classroom. And they would encourage their children to go, negotiate with the teacher for extra points, or to let them retake a test that the teacher had said, no, you can't do that. So they taught their children at a young age that they had autonomy and that they could speak with confidence to older adults to fight to get the maximum advantage possible, like in the example of grades. So the lower class parents had a very different perception of the role of institutions and their role in relation to them. So while these parents really did care a lot about their children's schooling and their success in school, and even kind of kept a close watch on them, they tended to take the perspective that it's the teacher's role to tell the parents what to do, that that's their job. And that if they need me to sign the homework, I'll do it. They need my child needs to come in for special testing, I'll bring her, but it's not going to be my role to tell them what to do. So very much supportive, but also very less active on the front end. They also noticed that they're very quiet when interacting with authorities. And in addition, that kind of was passed down to their kids, and that they told their kids, you just need to obey and not question authorities. So in all these different examples, there may be this tendency to think that the lower class parenting style is not as good. But there are a lot of good things here if we think about it. And what I like about this research is that Leroux really stresses that one parenting style isn't necessarily morally better than the other. The fact that children can play and be free to kind of explore their creativities and hang out with their siblings and cousins is actually can be viewed as a really good thing. Something that overscheduling, you may be robbing your kid of something that these other kids are actually getting to do. And she observed that these lower class kids are often actually better behaved, more creative in their use of free time, and had a well-developed sense of independence. On the other hand, these middle-class children were often seen as entitled. She even characterizes them as having this emerging sense of entitlement. And yet, I know we all kind of sense this, that there's definitely some advantages to this middle-class parenting style. The development of a large vocabulary, the knowledge of politics and science as you kind of talk and use language, and providing children with the tools that they need to know how to adjust and negotiate these situations, again, to kind of get the maximum advantage for them. And realizing that institutions are very complex and that it would be difficult for a young child to know how to navigate them. But why are there these advantages for these middle-class children? Because if we look at the institutions in our society, that these institutions are specifically set up by and for the middle class. And so the skills and the tools that these children are learning from their parents are extremely valuable in preparing them for life outside of the home. They learn how to speak comfortably with adults and to defend their opinions, and to be comfortable in these institutional settings that they'll eventually move into, like the university classroom or a business meeting or a committee meeting. And so we see the middle class children having this kind of emerging sense of entitlement. By contrast, the lower class children were seen as having an emerging sense of distance, distrust, and constraint. They didn't have the tools or skills necessary to customize their environment to kind of fit their needs. And so what this research is showing is that there's actually this cultural advantage for the middle class. And these are the kinds of things that we mean when we talk about class advantage. Things that we would miss if we were just focused on the individual. And so my goal with these examples has been to help us understand how to use this sociological perspective. To be able to see the world through this kind of lens can bring a lot of insight when we're interacting with people. For me, just having this kind of perspective allows me to go in and know quite a bit about a person's background before I even start talking to them. That I can sit across the table from a woman that fits this kind of profile we're talking about with all the different kids, and feel a lot more compassion and understanding for her situation, and not be so focused on the obvious personal character flaws or personal sin issues. And I can know a little bit more about how to act towards her and have some more insight into how to speak into her life. I mean, if you think about what we saw with those women about lack of purpose and lack of hope and lack of kind of potential they see in themselves for the future, like these are really deep areas that we could already potentially see without even having conversations with people. And we can already kind of see the key areas of disadvantage for people. Again, that question of why it makes sense that they are the way they are. Why it makes sense that they do the things that they do. And these are things that I think we need to know this because it can be so foreign to us. It's not how I act. It's not how I would do things. And I'm not around people enough to just immediately feel a sense of empathy for their situation. Okay, so to wrap up for tonight, we've talked about these 4 different tendencies. That we tend to operate out of a system of sympathy rather than grace. That we tend to focus on relief rather than development. We tend to engage in paternalism rather than empowering others. And we tend to focus on the individual rather than the group. So hopefully tonight, again, we're focusing on understanding. I hope this has given you kind of a broader perspective on how we can approach engaging with the poor, and given you a better and deeper understanding of who they are and why they are the way they are. And so, this is just one class. There's a lot of books out there, and there's a lot more specific examples. So if you run into a situation and you want to kind of explore it deeper, there's a lot of research and resources out there. And so if you have any specific questions, just let me know, and I can maybe point you to some different resources. But that kind of takes us to the end of the content. I'm going to have TJ come up here again, because we're gonna do this city engagement thing again for people that weren't able to go this week. But for the people that were able to go, we kind of just want to have some time to discuss, like hear from you, hear what your experiences were. And what it was like. So.
Do you have the sign up?
Yeah, I'll get that.
Okay.